Hello, this is Richard Payton, and I'm going to give you a brief overview of the customer service profile. This is for financial services, and I'm going to begin by going over the summary graph, and first a few considerations about how the summary graph works. So I guess the first thing I want to mention is that it's a 10-point scale, and it's not similar to the Profile XT, it's not actually a pure bell curve distribution. The scores for this assessment tend to trend a bit more to the right, and it's not precisely the same on each. So the biggest consideration when you're reviewing scores is to look at how a person's score, which is highlighted, the one that stands out from the others, how that score compares to the benchmark or the performance model, because the performance model itself is based upon the scores of top performers in this role, so people who have done well, and the scores then for people who have not done as well, typically, maybe not in every scale, but typically would not be as closely aligned to the actual benchmark that's been created. So let me go ahead and talk first actually about the vocabulary and numerical scores, or the cognitive scores and proficiencies, because these are very critical for your type of organization in describing whether a person is going to be able to meet the expectations for the job and actually the demands of the job when you get right down to it, because there's a certain expectation and ability to use the good vocabulary that's necessary for this type of job, and very much so there's a need to actually meet the numerical criteria, in other words, to be able to handle the calculations that are required on the job. So these go all the way up to a score of 10 because regardless of which performance model you're talking about, and there's a different performance model for each job, the minimum threshold is what you're really seeking. So a person who meets this threshold is much more likely to be able to meet the demands of the job than a person who does not. In fact, we've looked at this very rigorously for another organization in a state several states away, but nonetheless, we looked at the performance of the people who scored lower versus those who scored higher, and all the way down to the specific questions that they missed. And on numerical, for instance, we found that there was a clear dividing line between the questions that were necessary for the job, that the people who performed well on the job actually were able to accomplish or answer correctly, versus those that were not able to, not doing well on the job. So this is basically your candidate as a human dictionary and your candidate as a human calculator, and making sure that they can do the kinds of calculations and converse in the way that they need to on the job. Now let me talk some about the behavioral attributes. So if you've used the Profile XT, these are different measures. They're a little bit softer measure, you might say, than what you have in the Profile XT, and it's oriented toward the customer service role. So I'll talk through each one of these. Trust is the first one, which is essentially the belief that the motives of others are honorable, and how much an individual believes that that is true. So a person that has scores in the benchmark area generally has a fair amount of trust. A person with very high scores may be too trusting to be effective on the job, because they won't necessarily pick up on or at least acknowledge that someone may not be as trustworthy. On the lower side, that they may be a bit too vigilant or skeptical and not work as effectively when dealing with customers. Tact is a similar sort of dynamic in that we have the benchmark score. In this case, it's 5, 6, 7. The different color indicates that the score on for this candidate is outside of the range. It's just outside of the range, so it's not going to be a big hit for that. It's not going to reduce the overall job match significantly. If it was further out, then there would be more of an impact on the overall job fit. So there's more of a balance on tact. Again, if you've got someone who has very little tact, then they are so direct, so obvious in their in how they communicate that they may actually rub people the wrong way. Whereas a person who is so super tactful that you may not be able to pick up on whether they actually have an issue with what they're saying, and so they may not be able to communicate as effectively because you may not really get the true sense of whether there's an issue or not when they're talking to you. Empathy is a person's ability to understand other situations and their feelings, and so people who do well in this role have a fairly high level of empathy, and so this person scores right in the mix there, so they've got a good score. If you have a person who is not very empathetic, then they may not do as well in your organization in customer service, and actually that's based upon the scores of top performers, that indicates that they would not do as well. Conformity is a person's ability to comply with the rules of those in authority. And so again, you've got a bit of a balance. A person who is always looking out for exactly what the rules say may not be flexible enough, and I know flexibility is a different measure, but nonetheless, they may be a little bit too rigid in how they're conforming. And you don't necessarily want a person who, actually you won't want a person who has really low conformity because you're a regulated industry, and so there's a limit to how much you can not conform. Focus is actually a very high-scoring area for your organization, and those people who do not have as much focus are more distractible. They may be more inattentive and impulsive versus the people who have higher scores on focus, who they're able to pursue an objective, be more persistent, more purposeful, more single-minded, if you will. You've got a lot of detailed tasks that need to be done, and focus is a measure that helps you to get that. Flexibility is a person's ability to explore new approaches and to adapt to change. So you've got, again, on the upper end of the scale on flexibility, so people who are a little bit more adaptable or progressive versus those who are uncompromising or inflexible, who may not do as well in your organization. So those are the measures that we have that have a score, and then the next section goes into the individual behavioral traits and gives you a bit more understanding of this person's score. So some of what I've just discussed may be discussed in these areas as well. And then I'm going to go down, and those areas that they scored outside of the benchmark will have interview questions and considerations for interview. So this is where it can kind of tell you what exactly the impact might be of a person scoring above or below the performance model, and therefore things that you may want to focus on. So with the score that's a bit high on tact, then there's going to be a couple of questions that ask about how that may have worked in their prior work experience. Then finally, the last thing that we cover is company service perspective. And actually, I apologize, there was one thing I did not cover, and that is the overall job match. And so for this, this was clearly a person who has a very good overall job match, and so there's no concern there at all. We don't have, for each job, a cutoff point. You may, with experience, know that, and you may be able to go back and look to see people who have performed well and people who have not done as well, and find a break point where those people who score above, let's say 70 or 80%, whatever it might be, maybe it's 85%, that level that tends to indicate that people are going to work well or end up not working out as well in a position. If you're looking for a single number, if anyone has overall job match of less than 70%, I would say the odds are that that's probably not going to be a good fit in a job. And I think generally you're going to see better percentages than that. But if you can simply, with this assessment, avoid those people who are really not likely to be a good fit based upon generally not just one, although when it comes to numerical in a teller type or in many customer service type positions in your organization, that may be enough. But if overall, if there's not a good fit, then that can be an issue. And in the last area that I was getting ready to talk about, one more area of fit is company service perspective. So for your organization, there are a lot of questions that have been answered about how you would deliver customer service. And we look to see how your candidates answer those same questions. Now, there are some that are a little bit more gray area than others. And so, for instance, a question about whether you should, I think there's one in here about whether you should make conversation or let a customer chat if they want to. In this case, the organization answered that no, you shouldn't just let them chat. I mean, you should try to maximize the value of your time and of theirs and not just go off completely on tangents. So there may be some gray in this, but generally speaking, you don't always want to let your customers just chat on. If you have a candidate for a position that has a really low alignment with the organization, so maybe 70% is a good starting point, maybe you can look from your experience and see what the dividing line is where you've seen that there are more issues. But if you have someone who's aligned, then you're much less likely to have issues with that employee. If you do have questions, as you will with, I doubt you're going to have anyone who doesn't have some misalignment, but these are areas where you can have a conversation or where you can even orient training, not just for the individual, but even for the entire department or the entire group to talk about areas where there may be some difference of opinion about how customer service is delivered. So that's the overall look at the customer service and the profile. And if you've got any questions, certainly let me know. Best wishes in your hiring, and have a nice day.